In this case, you not only have to present enough evidence of the case itself, but also these underlying factors that give rise to the death penalty. Ooh, did I say the death penalty? I'm opposed to the death penalty. I just am. It's not equally applied. You know, I had somebody call me one day and said I was a piece of shit being opposed to the death penalty. I just don't think the government should be in the business.
Now that David Anthony Burke has been ordered to stand trial on charges related to the case of Celeste Rivas Hernandez, one of the most consequential questions surrounding the case has moved into focus. Capital punishment is formally on the table. If Burke is eventually convicted, the question will not simply be whether he should be punished. It will be what that punishment should ultimately look like. Should he receive the most severe sentence available under the law?
This case falls into that category where there is not one iota of evidence that the fire was arson. Not one iota.
Or would spending the rest of his life in prison be the harsher and more appropriate outcome? There is no simple answer. The question reaches far beyond this individual case, touching on a much larger debate over justice, punishment, and what the legal system is ultimately meant to accomplish. At its most basic level, capital punishment is the most final sentence available under the law for certain qualifying crimes. Rather than sentencing a person to spend the remainder of their life behind bars, the state determines that the offense is serious enough to justify an irreversible legal punishment. And that distinction is what makes the debate so consequential.
Is the death penalty right or wrong?
I used to think it was right, but as I've had more experiences, I'm completely against it.
A prison sentence takes away a person's freedom. Capital punishment takes away the possibility of anything ever coming after it. And that distinction is what makes the debate so consequential. A prison sentence takes away a person's freedom. Capital punishment takes away the possibility of anything ever coming after it. That gives the government an extraordinary amount of power, the authority to decide that an individual has committed an offense so serious that they should no longer be allowed to remain alive.
Thousands of death penalty opponents say Stacey Kirkendall's ex-husband was an innocent man put to death. She says that's not what Todd Willingham told her.
He burnt them. He admitted he burnt them to me, and he was convicted for his crime.
She made that statement before a scheduled hearing that could have exonerated Willingham from the murders, but attorney Gerald Goldstein, who's representing the Willingham family, says Kirkendall is better served making her statement before.
Given the severity of the allegations in this case, it is not difficult to understand why capital punishment has become part of the conversation. That gives the government an extraordinary amount of power, the authority to decide that an individual has committed an offense so serious that they should no longer be allowed to remain alive. Given the severity of the allegations in this case, it is not difficult to understand why capital punishment has become part of the conversation. But acknowledging the seriousness of that power leads to a deeper question. What is capital punishment actually supposed to accomplish? Is its purpose to protect society, to discourage others from committing similar crimes, to deliver justice for the victim and their family, or does it ultimately become a form of retribution carried out through the legal system? The answer matters, because depending on what someone believes punishment is meant to achieve, the question of whether Burke should face the most severe sentence available under the law if convicted can lead to very different conclusions. And this debate is much larger than any single case. Viewed through a broader historical and global lens, capital punishment remains one of the most contested issues in criminal justice. It is still legally available in parts of the United States and in several countries around the world. Yet most countries have either abolished the practice or stopped using it altogether. That shift accelerated significantly during the second half of the 20th century, reflecting a changing global debate over the questions capital punishment inevitably raises. Because the argument is not only about how severely society should punish its most serious offenses, it is also about how much power a justice system should have when the punishment can never be reversed. That shift accelerated significantly during the second half of the 20th century, reflecting a changing global debate over the questions capital punishment inevitably raises. Because the argument is not only about how severely society should punish its most serious offenses, it is also about how much power a justice system should have when the punishment can never be reversed. For thousands of years, justice often meant retaliation. Families took revenge. Communities answered one act with another, creating cycles in which violence was met with more violence. As governments and legal systems became more organized, that responsibility gradually shifted away from individuals. The principle was straightforward. Personal revenge would no longer determine punishment. The state would investigate, conduct a legal proceeding, and decide a person's fate through a structured and documented process. Personal retaliation gave way to institutional justice, yet one fundamental question remained unresolved. For thousands of years, justice often meant retaliation. Families took revenge. Communities answered one act with another, creating cycles in which violence was met with more violence. As governments and legal systems became more organized, that responsibility gradually shifted away from individuals. The principle was straightforward. Personal revenge would no longer determine punishment. The state would investigate, conduct a legal proceeding, and decide a person's fate through a structured and documented process. Personal retaliation gave way to institutional justice, yet one fundamental question remained unresolved. Once someone has been captured, received a fair trial, and been proven guilty, should the most irreversible sentence still be among the punishments a government is allowed to impose? For some, the answer is yes. Certain crimes, they argue, are so severe that only the most serious possible punishment can match the gravity of what occurred. Others, including world leaders, religious figures, and human rights organizations, believe governments should never have the authority to impose an irreversible punishment of this kind, particularly when life imprisonment can permanently separate a convicted person from society. But one of the strongest objections to capital punishment has little to do with sympathy for the person convicted. Instead, it centers on the reliability of the system making that decision. The punishment is irreversible. The justice system is not infallible. Those two realities exist in unavoidable tension, and nowhere are the consequences of that tension more permanent than in a capital punishment case. People have been sentenced to capital punishment only for later evidence to demonstrate that they did not commit the crime. Since 1973, at least 202 people in the United States have been exonerated and released from capital sentences. A justice system can correct some mistakes. The central question is what happens when the punishment leaves no opportunity to correct them. People have been sentenced to capital punishment only for later evidence to demonstrate that they did not commit the crime. Since 1973, at least 202 people in the United States have been exonerated and released from capital sentences. A justice system can correct some mistakes. The central question is what happens when the punishment leaves no opportunity to correct them. That record raises a question the justice system can never completely eliminate. If so many people were cleared before their sentences were carried out, how can anyone be absolutely certain that an innocent person has never been executed? And in a future case, how can the system guarantee that such an error will never happen? This is the problem at the center of capital punishment: its permanence. It is why some people who would have no moral objection to punishing someone they knew with certainty was guilty still oppose capital punishment as a matter of policy. Their concern is not necessarily the punishment itself. It is whether any imperfect system can administer an irreversible sentence without eventually making an irreversible mistake. Few cases illustrate that uncertainty more clearly than Cameron Todd Willingham. Willingham was a Texas man convicted of intentionally setting a fire in his home that ended the lives of his 3 young daughters. On February 17, 2004, he was executed by lethal injection. His former wife later said she believed he was guilty and claimed that he had confessed to her before his execution. That account, however, remains heavily disputed. Earlier accounts did not include that specific claim, and members of Willingham's family have argued that her story changed over time. The controversy does not mean that every piece of evidence conclusively proves an innocent man was executed. The central dispute instead involves the forensic fire science used to determine that the fire had been intentionally set. Independent experts later heavily criticized that science as outdated and unreliable. Whether Willingham was guilty has never been definitively resolved, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes the case so significant. Sometimes the most consequential question is not what can be proven after the fact, but what can no longer be corrected. Willingham was executed while serious questions surrounding the case continued, and those questions persisted long after the sentence had been carried out. At that point, there was no path back. A person wrongly imprisoned can potentially be released. Compensation can sometimes be offered for years that were unjustly taken away. An execution offers no equivalent remedy. That is why some of the strongest opposition to capital punishment is not rooted in sympathy for people convicted of serious crimes. It comes from a more fundamental concern: whether any human institution should be trusted with irreversible power over whether another person lives or dies. Capital punishment also carries another complication. It has not been applied consistently or equally across the legal system. Whether someone receives a capital sentence can depend on where the crime occurred, which prosecutor handled the case, the resources available for the defense, and other factors that may have little to do with the nature of the crime itself. As a result, two people convicted of similarly serious offenses can face dramatically different punishments. That inconsistency is part of the reason the United States has become increasingly reluctant to use capital punishment over the past 2 decades. In 1999, the United States carried out 98 capital sentences, the highest annual number since the practice resumed in 1976. Roughly 1/3 occurred in Texas alone. Since then, both the practice and new capital sentences have declined significantly across the country. That decline does not necessarily mean people stopped believing that certain crimes deserve the harshest possible punishment. It may instead reflect growing questions about whether the system can impose that punishment fairly, consistently, and without the risk of executing someone who should not have been. A punishment can be severe. The harder question is whether it can also be applied with certainty and consistency. Then there is deterrence. One of the most common arguments in favor of capital punishment is that the threat of the most severe sentence could discourage someone from committing a serious crime. But for that theory to work, several things have to happen first. The person must understand the potential punishment, know that it applies to the crime they are considering, weigh that consequence against what they intend to do, and then decide the risk is too great. Many crimes do not unfold through that kind of careful calculation. Some occur during moments of rage, panic, or extreme emotion when deliberate thinking about future legal consequences may play little role in a person's decisions. Others involve substances that can significantly impair judgment, undermining the rational cost-benefit analysis that deterrence depends on. And there is another problem. Some people commit crimes believing they will never be caught. In that mindset, the calculation is not life imprisonment versus capital punishment. The person expects neither. If they believe they will escape responsibility entirely, increasing the severity of the punishment may have little influence on the decision they make beforehand. The threat of punishment matters differently when someone never expects that punishment to reach them. That question becomes especially relevant in this case because prosecutors have alleged that what occurred was not impulsive. Their theory is that it involved deliberate planning, along with sustained efforts to conceal what happened both before and after. Even in a case involving alleged planning and concealment, the same question remains. If someone believes they can hide what happened and avoid punishment entirely, would the existence of capital punishment actually stop them? Or does capital punishment become relevant only after the person has been caught, convicted, and permanently removed from society? By then, the act that deterrence was supposed to prevent has already occurred. That is one reason research into the deterrent effect of capital punishment remains so contested. Studies have reached different conclusions, and separating its influence from the many other factors that affect homicide rates is extremely difficult. As a result, demonstrating that the threat of the most severe punishment prevents crimes that would otherwise have occurred remains a complicated challenge. That does not resolve the debate, but it does make deterrence far less straightforward than it may initially appear. And this is where the comparison between capital punishment and life without parole becomes especially important. The central argument for life without parole is that it can achieve many of the same objectives associated with capital punishment: permanent removal from society, severe and lasting punishment, and protection of the public. Yet it does so without carrying the same irreversible risk if the justice system later discovers that it made a mistake. That difference may seem small in theory. In practice, it changes everything. If someone serving life without parole is later found to be innocent, new evidence can at least create a path toward correcting the conviction. That path may be difficult, and an exoneration cannot restore the years already lost. A wrongful conviction causes damage that cannot simply be erased, but the possibility of correction still exists. Once an execution has been carried out, it does not. And in Burke's specific situation, if he is eventually convicted as charged, another factor enters the equation, one that makes the choice between these two punishments far more concrete than it would be in a purely hypothetical case. In Burke's case, that comparison takes on a more personal dimension because of the life he had already experienced before these charges. He reached an extraordinary level of success at a young age. International travel, millions of dollars in annual earnings, performances before massive crowds, and a public profile that was expanding as his career developed. Freedom, professional momentum, recognition, financial independence, and creative control were not abstract ideas to him. They were part of his everyday reality. A life without parole sentence would mean knowing that none of it was coming back. The music, the money, the recognition, the opportunities, the places he traveled, and the people he met. All of it would remain part of his memory while becoming permanently inaccessible to him. There would be no release date waiting somewhere in the future, no point at which the sentence simply ends and his former life resumes. Every remaining year would be spent inside an institution separated from the freedom and independence that had defined his previous existence. Sometimes punishment is measured not only by what someone loses, but by how long they are forced to live with that loss. A capital sentence presents a different reality. In California, capital cases can remain tied up in appeals and legal challenges for decades, and under the state's current moratorium, established after Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order in 2019, the sentence may never actually be carried out. Still, in jurisdictions where capital sentences are carried out, the punishment carries at least the possibility of a final endpoint. However distant or uncertain, life without parole offers no comparable conclusion. Barring a successful legal challenge or other change in the sentence, it continues for the remainder of the person's natural life in prison. That is what makes the comparison less obvious than it may initially seem. The punishment that appears harsher because of its finality is not necessarily the punishment that produces the longest period of deprivation. When measured across the full arc of a person's remaining life, the question becomes more complicated. Which punishment is truly more severe? The one that eventually ends, or the one a person may have to live with for decades? For Celeste Rivas, Hernandez's family, either outcome would carry significant consequences, but in very different ways. Those differences deserve to be considered without assuming that one form of punishment automatically provides greater closure than the other. A capital sentence in California would likely bring years, potentially decades, of continued litigation. Appeals, additional evidentiary hearings, federal habeas petitions, and other legal proceedings could repeatedly return the case to public attention. For some families, that continuing process can provide reassurance that the legal system is still treating the case with the seriousness they believe it deserves. For others, repeatedly returning to court can become an exhausting extension of an already painful experience. There is no universal definition of closure. Life without parole creates a different kind of finality. It lacks the dramatic endpoint associated with capital punishment, but it can provide a quieter, more stable outcome. Once that sentence is imposed and the direct appeals process has run its course, the convicted person remains incarcerated without the prospect of release, while the case generally does not return to active litigation with the same frequency and duration associated with a capital case. For some families, that certainty may matter most, knowing the person will remain in prison without repeatedly having to re-engage with decades of capital proceedings. What Celeste's family ultimately needs or wants from the legal process is something only they can define. Whatever their position may be, it deserves to be treated as a deeply personal response to an unimaginable loss. But beyond the courtroom, there is another practical consideration. People incarcerated for crimes against young individuals can occupy an especially difficult position within prison environments. The social hierarchies that exist inside correctional institutions can create additional challenges for people convicted of those offenses. And that reality introduces another dimension to what a lifetime behind bars can actually mean. Inside California's prison system, that reality could become especially significant. Given the public nature of this case, a person convicted of crimes against a young individual could face sustained challenges navigating the prison environment regardless of the housing classification ultimately assigned. Life without parole would not simply mean remaining in a cell while music continues generating income outside prison. It would mean living indefinitely within an institution shaped by its own rules, pressures, hierarchies, restrictions, and risks, knowing that every remaining year would be spent within that system with no scheduled release. That is the reality behind the phrase life without parole. The punishment is not a single moment. It is the accumulation of every year that follows. Yet when the discussion returns to the larger question, there is no simple conclusion. Capital punishment sits at the intersection of law, morality, public policy, and deeply personal beliefs about what justice is supposed to accomplish. Reasonable people can reach fundamentally different conclusions, and those views do not always fall into predictable categories. Someone can oppose capital punishment as a general principle while still recognizing why allegations this serious present one of the hardest tests of that belief. Someone else can support it in principle while acknowledging that California's current moratorium prevents the sentence from being carried out for as long as that policy remains in place, regardless of what a court imposes. And that brings the discussion back to the case itself. Celeste's family is being asked to endure the legal process surrounding allegations of extraordinary seriousness. Burke stands charged with homicide under special circumstances, allegations involving some of the most serious aggravating factors recognized under California law. None of that determines what the eventual punishment should be, nor does it change the fact that Burke has not yet been convicted of these charges. What it does reveal is why the question of punishment becomes so difficult in cases like this. What is appropriate? What is sufficient? And ultimately, which outcome actually serves justice? Those questions become much harder when the answer, once imposed, could last for the remainder of a person's life, or bring that life to a permanent end. Before capital punishment could become a reality in Burke's case, however, the prosecution would first have to clear several separate legal thresholds. The first is the conviction itself. Burke would have to be found guilty of first-degree homicide. The jury would also have to find at least one alleged special circumstance to be true: lying in wait, financial gain, or homicide committed to prevent testimony. Only then could the case move into a separate penalty phase. At that stage, the jury would face another decision entirely: whether the appropriate punishment is capital punishment or life without the possibility of parole. And for a capital sentence to be imposed, all 12 jurors would have to agree. A single juror refusing to support that punishment would prevent a unanimous verdict. In other words, capital punishment is not an automatic consequence of conviction. It requires an additional proceeding and a separate unanimous determination about punishment. The verdict and the penalty are connected, but legally, they are not the same decision. Even if a capital sentence were ultimately imposed, another layer of uncertainty would remain. California has maintained a moratorium on carrying out such sentences since 2019, meaning the sentence imposed by a court and whether it is ever actually carried out are two separate questions. Future governors and future policy decisions could determine what happens from there. As a result, someone given a capital sentence in California today could remain under that sentence without it ever being carried out, and that reality changes the practical comparison. If the question is which punishment would be more sustained for the person convicted, the answer may not be as obvious as it first appears. On one side is a capital sentence that, under California's current policy, may never be carried out. On the other is life without parole, a punishment experienced every day, potentially for decades, with no scheduled release. The law may define these sentences clearly. What they mean across the course of an entire life is far more complicated. Whether the final answer is capital punishment or a lifetime behind bars, one principle sits at the center of this debate. If the legal process ultimately proves that someone deliberately took an innocent life under circumstances, this serious, permanent removal from society is widely viewed as an appropriate consequence. The unresolved question is what that permanent punishment should look like, and what justice is supposed to accomplish beyond simply ensuring that the person never returns to society. That distinction matters because the punishment a legal system chooses ultimately reflects something larger than the fate of one defendant. It reflects what society believes justice itself is meant to achieve. For now, however, those questions remain hypothetical. David Anthony Burke has pleaded not guilty to all charges. He is presumed innocent unless and until the case against him is proven through the formal legal process. The allegations, regardless of their seriousness, are not themselves a conviction. The trial will determine what the evidence establishes. Only if that process results in the necessary convictions and findings would the case move to the separate question of punishment. And if a penalty phase is reached, the decision would then turn to which sentence the law allows and the jury determines is appropriate. Until then, the distinction is essential. A criminal case can raise profound questions about punishment long before anyone has legally earned that punishment. And in a case where the possible outcomes could mean either spending the remainder of a lifetime behind bars or receiving the most irreversible sentence the justice system can impose, that legal process is not a technicality. It is the foundation on which everything that follows must rest.